Well, today's lecture is on tea. I don't know if you're a tea drinker or a coffee drinker, but in the 18th century, everyone that lived in the Boston area was a tea drinker. Coffee was a specialty type thing. Well, the lecture that I do is tea, from afternoon tea to a medley of stories, anecdotes, and history. And as you see in this painting from 1900, it shows a group of women around a tea table, and they're actually enjoying the social ritual of a cup of tea in the afternoon. I actually drink iced tea in the afternoon. It's still as powerful, and if you know, tea is a great aspect of caffeine. But in a lot of ways, when we begin to realize tea is something that we not only find in supermarkets, but it's actually a broad-based thing. And Lipton tea, with their flow-through tea bags, is something that we'll see not only at the dollar store, but also at Stop and Shop. But the whole concept of tea is that it's an ancient, wonderful beverage. And tea is an aromatic beverage prepared by pouring hot water over cured or fresh leaves of the Camellia sinensis, an evergreen shrub native to East Asia, which probably originated in the borderlands of southwestern China. After plain water, tea is said to be the most widely consumed drink in the world. And there are many different types of tea, some having a cooling, slightly bitter, and astringent flavor, while others have vastly different profiles that include sweet, nutty, floral, or grassy notes. Well, the whole concept is the Camellia sinensis, seen here in an 18th century botanical print, is a species of an evergreen shrub, or small tree, whose leaves and leaf buds are used to produce tea. And the Camellia sinensis, of course, originated in Asia. But during that period, you began to realize that the history of tea dates to ancient China, almost 5,000 years ago. People in ancient China were said to have eaten tea leaves for centuries, perhaps even millennia, before consuming it as a beverage. The tea leaf has as much caffeine as the steeped tea leaves in hot water. So the whole concept was they would nibble on the leaves raw, often adding them to soups or greens, or ferment them and chew it like how betel is chewed. And according to legend, in 2732 BC, Emperor Shenyang, on the left, discovered tea when leaves from a wild tree were said to have blown into his pot of boiling water. The rest is history. Seemed pretty advantageous. Well, the idea is that tea, even in the 19th century, and this is a wonderful map of that period, shows that tea would be grown in such places as Shanghai, Hangzhou, Wenzhou, Fuzhou, Amoy, and Hong Kong. These areas produced a fine tea that wasn't just enjoyed locally, but would be part of the China trade. Now, most people think of the China trade as porcelains and silks and spices, but tea was a major part of it as well. Now, many people began to realize that tea cultivation is something that is labor intensive. This is a print from the Forbes House Museum in Milton, and it shows two men in the foreground not only watering, but the man in the background cultivating this tea plantation. It's not a huge plantation, but you plant the individual tea shrubs or bushes, and what you have to do is cultivate them 2 to 3 times a day. Now, within a year, these shrubs will grow to 3 feet. And at that point, you began to realize the maturity of the tea leaf was something that, when picked and dried, could then begin to produce a fine tea. And seen here again, on the right-hand side, you see the family's home. They would actually do this. And because of the labor intensity, tea was an expensive commodity. And because it was a drink of choice in China, you began to see in some ways that people would have thousands of acres of tea plantations, but even families might have something less than a half an acre. Well, the tea that grew wild in the Weiyu Mountains of China was once so difficult to harvest that it was said only monkeys could gather leaves from such inaccessible mountain cliffs. Therefore, South China tea merchants traditionally called their best tea monkey-picked to signify its rarity. And you see here on the right-hand side that monkeys were actually trained to pick the leaves. And you only had to feed them a banana or a piece of fruit. There was no 401k or health or dental. But these were monkey picked. And of course, because it was monkey picked, it actually commanded a higher price than the regular tea. Well, this is a wonderful print from 1800. It shows on the left-hand side the Hong, where they would actually conduct business. In the foreground were boxes of tea, and they would have a 40-pound wooden box filled with tea leaves that then could be shipped to Western Europe or even to the United States. But the whole aspect was tea was a marketable commodity enjoyed by millions, and we realized in some ways that it became part of a culture. Lu Yu, seen on the right-hand side, is the author of the Classic of Tea, commissioned by tea merchants after the drink had begun growing in popularity. With descriptions of leaf varieties, preparation techniques, and early version of the tea ceremony, the book, the oldest of its kind, marks him as the father of Chinese tea culture. He said that tea tempers the spirits and harmonizes the mind, dispels latitude and relieves fatigue, awakens thought and prevents drowsiness, lightens or refreshes the body, and clears the perceptive facilities. We need it today. But water is the mother of tea, the teapot is the father, and fire is the teacher, wrote Lu Yu in the Classics of Tea. So it was not only good for you, but it tasted wonderful. Here, a packing tea room for Europe shows that Congo tea was being packed. Now, look at the men on the left-hand side and the right in the back. They're in these hogsheads wooden boxes that would be filled with tea leaves. To get as much in there, do you see what they're doing? They're stamping it with their feet. Every time I see this print, I think of Lucille Ball when she stamped the grapes. But the whole idea was that was something that began to realize it was a good price for what you were paying, but it was also filled to the brim. Now, everything would be weighed. Everything weighed 40 pounds, and you can see the scale in the very center. But you also see on the left-hand side a Western merchant, somebody who was buying the tea to be sent back to England, France, or even the United States. And this photograph from 1910 shows in the foreground not only the boxes of tea, but also rough tea leaves, actually on a huge bamboo platter. This showed in some ways that the different types of tea that would be made and packed were being done even into the 20th century in the same manner that had been done for centuries. This painting shows the area of Wei-Lu, that area of China where the monkey-picked tea took place. In the foreground, you see these small little barges or hongs that could actually take the tea out to the ships in the harbor that would then create the China trade. But it was an important feature to realize this was a monopoly. China was producing the only tea in the world. So to get a commission to actually purchase the tea, you had to actually court many of these merchants. Now, Chinese small leaf tea that you can see on the right-hand side was introduced to India in 1836 by the British to break the Chinese monopoly on tea. In 1841, Archibald Campbell brought seeds of China tea from the Kuman region and experimented with tea planting in Darjeeling. The Alubari Tea Garden was opened in 1856 and Darjeeling tea began to be produced. And in 1848, Robert Fortune was sent to the East India Company on a mission to China to bring the tea plant back to Great Britain. He began his journey in high secrecy, and the Chinese tea plants he brought back were introduced to the Himalayas. And the British had discovered that a different variety of tea was endemic to Assam and the northeast region of India, which was then hybridized with Chinese small leaf tea. And using Chinese plantings and cultivation techniques, the British colonial government established a tea industry by offering land in Assam to any European who agreed to cultivate it for export. So in a subterfuge, they brought tea plants from China to the Himalayas, hybridized them with a tea leaf, and created a totally new type of tea. Not only was it tea, but it had a different flavor than the Chinese tea. And in that period, you realize these commercial tea plantations, and this is India, were first established under the British rule. And when a native Camellia sinensis plant was discovered by Scotsman Robert Bruce in Assam. Here, among the steppes, the tea plants were set out for maximum sunlight and cultivated daily to ensure a bountiful harvest. So when they found the new aspect of tea in Assam, they created an entirely new market. So you had Chinese tea and you had Indian tea. Indian was yellow, China tea was red, which was a little ribbon always on the teapot. But seen here, it was said that the Infanta Catherine of Braganza arrived in England from Portugal to marry King Charles II in 1662. She brought with her a casket of tea. The Portuguese had been importing tea from the beginning of the 17th century, and Catherine had grown up drinking tea as the preferred everyday beverage. It was she who introduced the tea ceremony at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to the British royal family. And during that period, you began to realize it became the fashion. In 1750, tea had become the British national drink, and tea houses became a popular resort for the affluent to drink and be seen drinking tea. Tea was also touted as a delicious beverage with therapeutic properties. Today we think of coffee houses. Granted, you have a cup of coffee, you meet with friends and family, but this was something that was even more elegant. They would set out a tea table and you would enjoy it, hopefully being watched by somebody because it was so expensive. And here, again, another tea ceremony in a private house. We see 3 women in front of a tea table, and you began to see the beginning of the accoutrements for tea. A pot, a hot water pot, as well as a tea caddy and a slop pot for the wet tea leaves. So in many instances, even here in the United States, this painting from the 1770s shows a family, including their 2 children, around a tea table enjoying tea. The little dog in the foreground is barking. Somebody's eating, of course. But the whole idea was they had pieces of silver that was used in this instance to create that tea ceremony. And it really became a big deal because people looked at this as something that was not only elegant, but it was a nice way to break up the afternoon. The East India Company brought back many products, of which tea was just one, but proved one of the most successful. It was initially promoted as a medicinal beverage or tonic, but by the end of the 17th century it was taken as an all-purpose drink, albeit mainly by the elite, as it was still expensive. And the tea would be brought by clipper ship all the way to England. Now, some of the people that actually began to sell the tea being brought from China are pretty well known. And this is Sir Thomas Twining. I'm sure you've all heard of Twining tea. He started Tom's Coffee House at 216 The Strand in London in 1706. In addition to coffee, Twining sold tea and acquired a reputation for having the finest blends in London. And shortly after opening on the Strand, Twining was selling more dry tea than brewed tea. And you realized in this instance that it's still there today. Twining's tea store on the Strand, the very tall building, even served customers with royal connections. Twining's son Daniel was the first Twining to export tea, and legends show that by 1749, Twining's tea was sold in America. Thomas Hutchinson of Boston was a customer, and when American patriots dumped English tea into Boston Harbor a few years later, a distinguished writer noted, "It was not Twining's tea the Boston rebels tossed into the sea." But the idea was, by 1900, Twining's touted themselves as the oldest tea firm in the world, 1706. They were also patronized by Her Majesty the Queen, Victoria, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, and His Royal Highness, the Duke of York. So they were specialists in fine teas and coffees and unsurpassed for quality. They were people that realized, in this instance, they were purveyors of a fine product. Well, this is the interior of Twining's store today. When I lived in London, I lived not too far from this, and I would always go, because I would have to go for 3 weeks at a time, to actually get the tea and coffee. But by 1700, tea was being sold by grocers and tea shops in London, the latter frequented by women as well as men. And by the 1720s, black tea overtook green tea in popularity as the price dropped. And early on, British drinkers began adding sugar and milk to tea, a practice that was not done in China. This is the shop today, selling tea and coffee, and the portraits are all of the Twining family. Now, in a lot of ways, tea remained a very important item in Britain's global trade, contributing in part to Britain's global dominance by the end of the 18th century. Yet it was highly taxed. And because it was so expensive as well as highly taxed, there was widespread smuggling as tea was enjoyed by the colonists. The man looks, there's a tax on tea. It seemed like there was a tax on everything during the 1760s and 1770s. But the whole aspect was, it was the drink of choice, and people did pay the tax. Now, during that period, there were many people in Boston that not only enjoyed tea, but made the accoutrements for the tea table. And you see Paul Revere on the left-hand side. Each piece in the tea service had its function. The teapot on its stand held hot water. The tea caddy, a lockable box, held loose tea. And there might be a tray on which to display the caddy. A pitcher for cream and a covered urn for sugar lumps. A pair of sugar tongs was used for putting the sugar lumps into the teacups. And the small shell scoop was kept inside the tea caddy and was used for measuring the tea. Well, Paul Revere made this service, obviously for a very wealthy Bostonian. It's in the collection of the Worcester Art Museum, and it's showing how a family of wealth who would have enjoyed tea in the afternoon. But during the 1760s and 1770s, even though it was taxed, people enjoyed it. But by the Revolution, we began to realize, with the Boston Massacre in 1770, the drinking of tea in the American colonies was largely influenced by the passage of the Tea Act and its subsequent protests during the American Revolution. Tea consumption sharply decreased in America during and after the Revolution, when many Americans switched from drinking tea to drinking coffee, considering tea drinking to be unpatriotic. Now, on the right-hand side, you see the Liberty Tree that was at the site of the Liberty Tea Tavern, Washington Street and Essex Street. A man in the foreground has been tarred and feathered. He was probably a tax collector. So not only was his body burnt by the hot tar, the feathers, but he's being forced to drink hot tea. So you began to realize the rowdies, or the Sons of Liberty, were beginning in some ways to show people that they were in charge of Boston. And in early 1773, the women of Boston and their families subscribed their names to a league, binding themselves not only to use any more teas until import clause in the Revenue Act should be repealed, and their daughters speedily followed their patriotic example, and 3 days afterwards, a multitude of young ladies in Boston and vicinity signed the following pledge. We, the daughters of those patriots who have and do now appear for the public interest, and in that principle regard their posterity, as such do with pleasure engage with them in denying ourselves the drinking of foreign tea, in hopes to frustrate a plan which tends to deprive a whole community of all that is valuable in life. So people began to realize, if you drank tea, you were not a patriot. People made rosehip tea, they made acorn tea, and a variety of other things that were not quite as palatable, but the whole idea was, in this instance, this shows a woman at her tea table, and it says, "A lady's adieu to her tea table." Farewell the tea board with your gaudy attire, ye cups and ye saucers that I did admire. To my cream pot and tongs I now bid adieu, the pleasures all fled that I once found in you. No more shall my teapot so generous be, in filling the cups with this pernicious tea, for I'll fill it with water and drink out the same, before I lose liberty, that dearest name. So people did actually give it up. But during the 1773 period, Samuel Sprague, a well-known son of liberty, said that that evening, meaning December 16, 1773, I met some lads hurrying towards Griffin's Wharf. I joined them, and on reaching the wharf found the Indians busy with the tea chests. I obtained a quantity of soot, which I blackened my face, and joining the party I recognized among them Mr. Etheridge, my master. We worked together, but neither of us ever afterwards alluded to the other's share in the proceedings. So the Boston Tea Party started in the Old South Meeting House, and it was the Sons of Liberty that destroyed the tea. Well, William Roach Sr., who was a wealthy ship owner from Nantucket, is seen on the left. For a return load to Boston, the captain loaded the Dartmouth, his ship, with a cargo of 114 chests of British East India Company tea. And this was the first of the Tea Party ships to arrive at Griffin's Wharf in Boston. She arrived in Boston on Sunday, November 28, 1773. The second ship, the Eleanor, arrived on December 2nd, also carrying 114 chests of tea, and John Roe, for whom Roe's Wharf was named, was the owner of the merchant vessel Eleanor. And the third ship was the Beaver, and this arrived on December 15th, carrying 112 chests of tea. And of course, Bostonians threw 340 crates of tea into Boston Harbor to protest what they saw as unfair taxation by the British Parliament. Well, the Tea Party was something that people really rallied around. And this was a ditty that was written at the time. It said, on to where the tea ships ride, and now their ranks are forming. A rush, and up the Dartmouth side the Mohawk band is swarming. See the fierce natives, what a glimpse of paint and fur and feather, as all at once the full-grown imps light on the deck together. A scarf the pigtail secret keeps, a blanket hides the breeches, and out of the cursed cargo leaps, and overboard it pitches. O woman at the evening board, so gracious, sweet, and purring, so happy while the tea is poured, so blessed while spoons are stirring. What martyr can compare with thee, the mother, wife, or daughter, that night, instead of best bohea, condemned to milk and water? And of course, by that period, you realize tea floated into every single aspect of Boston Harbor. And a historic-minded Bostonian scooped wet leaf teas from Boston Harbor and preserved them in this bottle with a handwritten label after the famous Boston Tea Party of 1773. So it was something that was not only an act of defiance, but it was one of the major features that led up to the Battle of Bunker Hill. But you realized, even in the 19th century, Currier and Ives was still making prints of the Boston Tea Party. In retaliation to the Tea Party, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, including the Boston Port Bill, which shut off the city's sea trade pending payment for the destroyed tea. The British government's effort to single out Massachusetts for punishment served only to unite the colonies and impel the drift towards war. Because Boston had a mercantile trade, with ships not able to leave the harbor, there was no way to trade up and down the seacoast or the West Indies or the Caribbean. So by the 19th century, after the Tea Party, we began to realize that tea may not have been the drink of choice in Boston, but it was the drink of choice in the world. This is a picture map of the tea world, and it shows, of course, in the very center, Africa and Western Europe, but it also shows North and South America on the far left. This was an important feature because during this period, people began to import tea by clipper ship from China. And this is the Raymond, and Hugh Mackay was commander, and it was the first vessel to sail direct from China to Hull, England, on her arrival in 1843 with a cargo of tea. A clipper ship, which could be built by Donald Mackay of East Boston, could usually do that route, which was from China across the Pacific, around the Cape of Africa's Horn, and then up to England in less than 60 days. So the faster you got there, the higher the price you could command. And during that period, it showed that even Twinings, that was importing tea by clipper ship, shows that a China clipper home from Foochow. And before the days of steam, meaning a steam ship, China tea was brought to England in fast clippers, racing home with the new crop. So by the time it arrived, you could command double the price of what it might be a month later. Well, some of the teas began to actually be called by different names. It was still tea, but it had a different name, so it began to give a little bit of a cachet. Well, this was the Mazawaddy Tea Company, and it was founded in 1887 by the Desham family, and was one of the most important and most advertised tea firms in Britain during the late 19th century. The idea of using the word Mazathwati, perhaps based on the Hindi maza, which means pleasure or fun, or the Senghalese wati, which means a garden, this was shortened to Mazawaddy and duly registered as a trademark for retail sales in January 1887. Mazawaddy tea was no different than China tea, but the Desham family decided they were going to call their tea Mazawaddy. Now look at the wonderful thing. It's the largest teacup I've ever seen in my life. But look at the faces. It's the faces of the world. Everybody was enjoying Mazawaddy tea. So why shouldn't you? Advertising and marketing was the biggest thing. And here, in an advertisement called Old Folks at Home, the model for the grandmother was Mary Ann Clark, the wife of an Islington, England bootmaker. And the child on the right was the little girl next door, Alice Emma Nichols. Well, they're enjoying Mazawaddy tea, so if our elders and our youngest enjoy Mazawaddy tea, so too would you. But Mazawaddy took it one step further, and a team of 4 zebras hitched to a wagon advertising Mazawaddy tea in Tunbridge Wells, England, attracting great attention and boosting sales. So I bet if a tea wagon went by here at the Quincy Senior Center by 4 zebra, we'd all be at the window. This was something that was unique, a great advertisement. Adults liked it, but children loved it. So tea could be marketed in many different ways. Now, the origins of Lipton tea lie with spirited founder Sir Thomas Lipton. After opening his first grocery shop in Glasgow in 1871, he bought tea fields in Ceylon, now called Sri Lanka, in 1890. This was the beginning of a revolution that would see him bring tea to the masses, including his native United Kingdom. Now, Lipton tea is a fine tea, but seen here, it was actually marketed as Ceylon tea. And what he did was not only to sell it in his stores, and he had upwards of 50 stores throughout Great Britain, but he was a man of firsts. And Sir Thomas took self-promotion to a whole new level, using spectacular publicity stunts at every opportunity. And when the first Lipton grocery store opened in Glasgow in 1871, he celebrated by importing the world's largest cheese and issuing Lipton currency notes. And the man knew how to entertain, and it paid off, soon creating a nation of Lipton lovers. The cheese was so large it was larger than a dining room table in height and size. You could help yourself. But the Lipton tea currency meant that you could only spend that currency at his grocery store. So, of course, if you're buying tea, you might buy it there. But he was also somebody that had bought tea gardens. Now, Ceylon at that period of time was a major part of the tea cultivation. He bought upwards of 1,100 acres, and in that instance, he not only grew the tea and had it cultivated, but it was sent to England for him and his sole purpose. So this was the finest the world could produce. It was rich, pure, fragrant, and you see in some instances, even Her Majesty Victoria the Queen used this at Buckingham Palace. So Lipton was somebody who invested his money in buying land and growing the product that he was going to sell in his own store, and he became a multimillionaire. In that way, in this postcard of the 1930s, Sir Thomas Lipton was always the master of marketing, especially when it came to touting the fact that he indeed owned the Ceylon Gardens, wherein his teas were grown. Direct from the grower was his favorite slogan. But look at how they actually transported it to the water. Elephants would actually hold these 40-pound boxes of Lipton tea. And in that way, not only the postcard was somewhat exotic, but it was also showing that Lipton in Ceylon was using, of course, native help, but it was also employing elephants in its transportation. By 1910, Lipton's advertisement said that teas, famous the world over, and it asks, have you enjoyed them? Well, from that little teacup comes a little bit of steam, and you see women of the world enjoying Lipton tea. So advertising and marketing was a major feature, and by the 1950s, this advertisement showed brisk Lipton's tea. It says, are you feeling fagged? No energy? Man, you need a brisk Lipton tea. It says a cuppa brisk, you'll notice the difference when you taste Lipton's. So not only was it delicious, but even hot tea had a great caffeine count, so didn't iced tea. But this was a great way to do it because all you had to do was use one tea bag. Now, during that period, there were many tea tasters, and these tea tasters would actually taste a variety of different tea that had been steeped from the leaves brought from Assam, Darjeeling, Ceylon, or even China. And here you see a grouping of cups that actually had the tea itself. He must have had a great palate because, of course, tea has a very gentle taste, but it doesn't really have a huge flavor. So in that way, we began to see that these teas were a major part of the marketing. This was called Brahma brand, and it was from Ceylon, not Lipton, and it was something that was called something that was not only well known, but it was called the Brahma brand. So again, this was used in England. They'd also have different teas, and in 1822, brothers Joseph and Edward Tetley started to sell tea and were so successful they set up as Joseph Tetley and Company tea merchants in 1837. Relocating to London in 1856, they formed Joseph Tetley and Company, wholesale tea dealers, and became a great success. Twinings, Lipton's, Brahman, and of course Tetley, you began to realize those are only 4 of what would be dozens of different tea companies. Tetley tea, like good children, never beaten. Don't you love that card? Of course, you know, you say to yourself, even at that time, my mother never actually held off with a stick, but the idea here was that children loved it, and they were well behaved because they were serving a cup of tea. Well, even Lady Barnett said, tea tastes so much better made this modern way, and I find Tetley tea bags so very economical. Lady Isabel Barnett of BBC's TV What's My Line fame sold the nation. Flavor comes first with me when choosing tea, and that is why I'm so delighted when I learned that Tetley tea bags not only save time and trouble, but make really excellent tea as well. So advertising, including famous people from television, would help to sell the tea. Now, many of us use tea bags. I always do, but the idea was when I use loose tea, it's usually for somebody who is special and older that I want to do something very nice. But these are tea bags from 1920 to 1951. They were referred to as gray ladies, and they were the 20th century invention. Those silver and metal perforated balls to hold loose tea leaves were used previously. The story was that Thomas Sullivan, a New York tea merchant, sent out samples of tea in small silken bags. Some customers assumed that they should put the whole bag into the pot, and it worked. So on the left, 1920, it was simply a small bag. And eventually, by 1951, it became a flow-through bag. So you had water on all 4 sides. Tetley, by the 1950s, actually had this man who was the tea taster. He's actually in shorts, with being shielded from the sun with a parasol, and it says the Tetley tea taster goes where tiny tea leaves grow. Not only did he go there, but he also began to taste it. And it says, how many teas does Tetley tea taster taste? It's like Peter Piper picked a pickled peppers. But the idea was you can see him with all of these individual bowls of tea. He would sip from each one. Some were refused, others accepted. But Tetley tea had become a major part of the tea trade. Now, seen here, how the Tetley tea taster civilized iced tea. Now, not many people drink anything cold in England. I always used to remember to ask for some ice was like one piece. But the idea here was that iced tea, especially in the summer months, was a delicious beverage and refreshing. But it was only something that began in the 1940s and 1950s. But the idea was, during that period, tea was still being used as a social ritual. Now, this is Beeton's Book of Household Management, and it was published in 1861 in London. The book sold us 60,000 copies in its first year and more than 2 million within 7 years of publication, making it one of the most famous cookbooks ever published. Well, this was something that not only showed you how to make wonderful things to impress family and friends, but how to run your house. Now, Isabella Mary Mason Beeton, seen on the right, known as Mrs. Beeton, even though she wasn't married, was an English journalist, editor, and writer. Her name is particularly associated with her first book, published in 1861, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. You see a page directly below with all sorts of different sweets that you could actually serve with your tea. But she was somebody in a lot of ways that went the gamut. This is a double-page spread with not only jellies, but cakes and sponges and different things that I would love to try. But the whole idea was, however your tea was served, whether it was in a very formal way or just a mug of tea, these were things that you might want to make. Well, Isabella Beeton also had paintings done that would show how to set a tea table. The woman who would actually be the hostess would sit at the chair on the right. The tray in front of her had not just the teapot, but the hot water kettle just to its left, and teacups. You also see sliced bread that had been buttered, little pieces of cake, and of course cookies. It was a very simple tea, but flowers everywhere. So during this period, Isabella Beeton became so well known that her book went through multiple reprintings. But you also saw people such as Tara McIntosh. 2 teacups on 2 double D cups. A light-hearted photo of the beautiful and delicate Tara McIntosh, known as Teacup Sally, serving tea at her delightful and famous tea house known as the Twin Tarts. She said, "Tea for 2 and 2 for tea. Picture me upon your knee, just tea for 2 and 2 for tea. Just me for you and you for me alone. Nobody near us to see us or hear us, no friends or relations, weekend vacations. We won't have it known, dear, that we own a telephone, dear. Day will break and I'll awake and start to bake a sugar cake for you to take for all the boys to see. We will raise a family, a boy for you and a girl for me. Oh, can't you see how happy we would be?" Well, she was a well-known purveyor of tea. But Boston also had tea after the Revolution. And in the 1840s and 1850s, many men who had come from Canton or China began to live in Boston because of the clipper ship trade. Many people would see the Chinese serving as sailors on these clipper ships, and some did stay. Well, A.R. Shaw, who lived in Melrose, Massachusetts, was a wholesale and retail dealer of tea and coffee on Union Street in Boston. Now, this dated to 1847. It's a great example showing that he imported not just tea, but also coffee. And of course, even here, the New Chinaman's Tea Store, which was at 333 Congress Street, was a great example that would actually see coffee and tea being sold. From China and Japan to San Francisco and thence by rail to this city, all goods warranted, money refunded if goods do not prove as represented. Now, the whole idea was it was somewhat exotic. And tea, which was in some instances Chinese, but mostly Indian, was something that people loved. Boston's Chinatown, which began roughly in the 1870s, would have, by the turn of the 20th century, tea houses. And we see a merchant here in the foreground, the altar to the ancestors directly behind him, but people could come and enjoy tea and whatever type of dessert or specialty cookie or biscuit that would be served by the Chinese would be enjoyed. It was exotic, but it was also in some ways a very small area, mostly Harrison Avenue and Essex Street. But tea was important, and it was sold by people such as S.S. Pierce. My latest book on S.S. Pierce just came out, and he was a purveyor of not only fancy goods and gourmet items, but the largest sale of what we would realize of wines and spirits. He started in 1831 at the corner of Court and Tremont Street, and S.S. Pierce, or Samuel Pierce, started with Eldad Worcester. And by 1841, he was known as Samuel Pierce Company. He imported tea. And this is a box or a hogshead of Congou. And Congou refers to a tea made with the highest mastery or careful skill to produce thin, light strips without breaking the leaves. It is a black Chinese tea variety used by 19th century tea importers in America and Europe. It was the base of the 19th century English breakfast tea blend. Well, this extra choicest English breakfast Congou tea was imported by S.S. Pierce and Company, and it was sold right up through the 1960s. Here, in an advertisement from the Epicure, which was S.S. Pierce's catalog that had 25,000 items that you could actually have shipped to you, had, as we see here, orange pekoe tea, Assam tea, early pickings Keemung Congou, extra choicest Formosa Oolong, flowery pekoe tea, and of course, in the very center, choicest New Season's English breakfast Congou. So these were a variety of different teas, and there were upwards of 40 different varieties sold. But you could also blend them to create your own special blend. And S.S. Pierce sold them not only in small 1-pound packages, but even as large as 5. Now, they did sell one tea that was called the Tsarina Afternoon Tea. And this was blended by S.S. Pierce and named in honor of Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia. And it was an expensive tea, selling $5 for 1 pound in 1990. So if you're feeling a little bit imperial, you could actually enjoy a cup of Tsarina tea. But during this period, tea became a ceremony, a ritual that nourishes the body and the soul. The act of pouring tea is a graceful dance, a moment of mindfulness and reverence. Tea time is a sacred ritual that connects us to generations past. Tea drinking is an art, a ritual that celebrates the beauty of life. So that tea ceremony became so important by 1900 that it wasn't just adults but even children enjoying afternoon tea. It was also part of paintings. In L'été by Mary Cassatt shows 2 women who play the traditional roles of hostess and guest. The hostess rests her hand on her chin while her guest sips her tea. Not just the painting, but the silver tea service was donated to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So you began to see, even for a cup of tea, the silver service came out. And of course here, Henry James said in his book, The Portrait of a Lady, that there are few hours in life more agreeable than the hour dedicated to the ceremony known as afternoon tea. This painting by Edmund Tarbell captures the ritual with a damask tablecloth, silver teapot and water urn, and a plate of cookies. So whether it was simply a cup of tea and a cookie, it actually was something that you sat, enjoyed the tea, and had a small type of ritual. The children loved it as well, and this is a ditty called The Doll's Tea Party. With tiny cups and plates so bright, she sets the table just right. The doll's tea party, grand and gay, where make-believe brightens the day. A gentle pour, a dainty sip, her dolls all gathered a happy group. She chats and giggles, a joyful sound, friendship and love all around. The sugar bowl, a precious thing, each doll receives a happy fling. A story told, a sweet refrain. In this dull world, joy will remain. And you see the doll actually enjoying her cup of tea on the left-hand side as the child's tea party. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was a child, I was always asked to perform I'm a Little Teapot. And I hope there were at least 5 encores. But my aunts and uncles all loved it. And of course we see this little girl, and it says, I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here is my handle, here is my spout. When I get all steamed up, hear me shout. Tip me over and pour me out. Did anyone else sing this as a child? Of course, it was endemic in Boston. I don't know if you sung it as best as me, but hey. Well, by 1960, everything brightens up brisk Lipton tea. And we see this woman on the left-hand side, somewhat shady and gaunt, and she drinks her tea in the middle. Look what she looks like after that cup of tea. Let's all go home and have a cup of tea tonight. But the idea was, it was true. You did feel better sometimes because the tea had a little bit of aspect of energy. And of course here, tea peps you up. It's the woman on the left-hand side saying, darling, how good and cool I feel. And just a little while ago, I was hot and exhausted. That's what iced black tea does for me. It hits the spot, and it's so cooling, too. I'm devoted to tea anyway, all year round. It always peps me up. Well, it did. And iced tea became the thing in the 40s and 50s. People loved it, and today it's something that's a great drink if you don't want to have something that's alcoholic. Well, look at this. Take tea and see. Which will you drink for dinner tonight? See what a glow you'll get from the hot and hearty tea. And see if it doesn't help you feel better, sleep better too. Well, there's a man down below, a muscle man, holding Take Tea and See, and you began to realize, try tea on the beefy side. And that was something in some ways, they even had beef tea. But the idea here was, tea was purported as something you could even enjoy with dinner. And of course, today on Amazon, they have monkey pick tea. I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, but it was said that the ancient tea bushes, which grow high up on the pointy mountain cliffs, produce the utmost best tea. Naturally, these tea bushes were almost impossible to get by tea farmers. Thus, the legend tells of tea farmers training pet monkeys to climb the steep cliffs and pick the leaves. Legend has it that monkeys were trained by monks to pick the choicest leaves from wild tea trees grown in the Huayu Mountains of the Fujian province. This monkey-picked tea, which sells for $40, it's only 8 ounces, was presented as a tribute to the Emperor Qianlong in 1741, and for many years was enjoyed exclusively at the imperial court. So people began to see in some ways that you could enjoy a cup of tea. And you didn't necessarily have to have friends and family. So this is the tea party. I had a little tea party this afternoon at 3. 'Twas very small, 3 guests and all, just I, myself, and me. Myself ate all the sandwiches while I drank up the tea. 'Twas also I who ate the pie and passed the cake to me. Sometimes that's a nice way to do it. And of course, tea. It makes everything better. So you begin to realize that tea has not only a wonderful sense of history 5,000 years ago in China, but through hybridization with Assam and Ceylon teas, they began to create new varieties, so that by the 19th and 20th century, one would see at least 40 different varieties of hybridized tea. In that way, tea is something that gives quick energy. Not only eating the leaves, but steeping them in hot water. So seen here with this woman who enjoys a cup of hot tea, take a few minutes, enjoy it, and realize how wonderful and historical tea really is. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.